Croeso I Llwyfan Cymru. Welcome to this Wales stage and this August Book of the Month special live Q&A with Matt Haig, celebrating the publication of this wonderful book, The Midnight Library, which I'm delighted to say has today gone to #1 in the book charts. Congratulations. Thank you for joining us, Matt Haig.
Thank you, Peter. This is lovely to be here. I do wish we were in a tent in Wales, but this is the next best thing. I like this very much, and it's great to be chatting to you again.
It's a lovely intimacy this format has. How have you been during lockdown?
Well, it's been like, for many people, it's been a bit of a mixed bag. I was like loads of people, addicted to the news and extremely stressed out and feeling quite apocalyptic in March and April. Then May, June sort of time, I actually realized there are aspects of this situation I quite like and appreciate and would want to carry with me beyond in a post-COVID future. I feel like, you know, the fact that we've had this forced life edit upon us has actually meant we actually can see what we value and what we don't value in very clear terms, and what we miss and what we don't miss. And yeah, I mean, it's been up and down. It's dragging on a bit now. This little part is hard, I think, because everyone's on slightly different tracks. You'll have family members and friends on slightly different tracks. So I think, you know, it was almost clearer when everyone was on the same hymn sheet. This is a little bit tricky, but it's been very strange having a book launch during this time. It's meant in some ways, it's been good in some ways, because I can do more events like this, and I can do them from my living room in Brighton, and I haven't had to get trains up and down the country or stay in hotels off roundabouts and things like that. So that's been good. But it's also been strange. The not meeting people has been a bit weird. So, you know, it's great to do a book event. It's great to know people are there watching this. But, you know, actually meeting people is obviously something different and something I miss a little bit. Yes.
We've all been forced to live this kind of alternative life, which in some ways does make the entire thing seem like a kind of promo for your book. Could you set us up with the basic concept of this book? Because like How to Stop Time, it has a very strong concept, an idea behind it, which defines the story that you're trying to tell.
Yes, it's high concept, I suppose, is what you'd call it. It's the library of the title. The Midnight Library is a library that exists between life and death, and every single book on that library, in that library, and it's an infinite library. The bookshelves go on forever, so it's TARDIS-like. Once you're inside it, once the protagonist Nora Seed is inside the library, she sees that the bookshelves go on for eternity, and every book on the shelf is a shade of green. There are no titles on the bookshelf. She sees a woman she recognizes within the library, and this woman is Mrs. Elm, her librarian, her school librarian when she was a child. But this isn't her school library. This is very clearly different and more literally magical. And she is told by the librarian that every single book except one on the shelves is a different version of her life. So Nora, this person full of regrets, full of mistakes, what she sees as mistakes she's made in her life, people she's let down, disappointments she's had, disappointments she feels she's caused. She now potentially has a chance to see how her life could have been, not only by reading her life, but actually if she opens the book, she falls into that life. So all the things she could have been, like an Olympic swimmer, like a glaciologist in the Arctic Circle, like a rock star, like someone who owns a vineyard, all the dreams, distant or close, that she's ever had, she now has a chance to actually make real, or rather to inhabit the lives which already are real, but in other universes. And Yeah, that's the essential part of it. Nora herself was suicidal. This is how she's ended up in a situation between life and death. So it starts quite bleakly, I suppose. We see Nora at her lowest point in life. And yes, this library is basically her eye into all those other alternatives. And, you know, as we know from our own single timeline, the things in life which we think are going to be great and rewarding aren't always so. And likewise, the lives that we think are going to be terrible might not be as terrible as we imagine.
Now, you literally throw a dead cat down in the beginning of this book. And that's partly about a kind of link of mortality, and it's partly about trying to define what she cares about and what will tip her over the edge. Why did you choose a cat, and what are you doing with it, Matt?
Well, I like having an animal in a book. Occasionally, I've had dead animals in books. The biggest mistake I ever made with a book was my first book, which was The Last Family in England, where I ended with a dead pet. I've learned my lesson, and if you're going to have a dead pet, you start with a dead pet. And the cat, well, you know, there's a without, you know, I'm not a scientist, but I'm a science fiction geek sometimes when I'm writing books, and there's a lot of quantum physics in this book. So it's a nod to Schrödinger's cat and how different outcomes can happen. It's also a kind of symbol for Nora and her state of mind at the start of the book. You know, she's living alone with her cat. The cat is now dead. It's not the only thing that's going on in Nora's life, which is sort of makes her full of despair, but it's kind of the significant, one of the two significant triggers that alter her state of mind on that day as she sort of sits there bleakly drinking wine and feeling depressed and taking her antidepressants. And yeah, it's just kind of like the straw that broke the camel's back. It's also autobiographical because, like lots of people, I used to have cats. I don't have any cats at the moment, but that used to be like the most traumatic thing for me as a child, was when someone came around to the door and actually would point out that our cat is lying still in the street after being hit by a car. You know, that was a very traumatic thing. So, you know, novels are a perfect way to process that childhood trauma we have from our dead pets. And yeah, that's about it, really. Also, it's a pretentious cat because it's called Voltaire, and that links to Nora's love, and she's a former student of philosophy, and that comes back as well through the book. Sorry.
We'll come back to multiverses in a minute, but can I just pick up, when you say you're not a scientist, but you're engaged in science, you have become, through the publication of Reasons to Stay Alive, a much treasured participant in the idea of talking about mental health. You have led the charge on being open and being engaged and hugely empathetic. This novel is not, it's not like How to Stop Time was a kind of metaphor for mental health. It is actually full on about state of mind, isn't it? And I'm fascinated by the way in which you turn to fiction here after that beautiful memoir, and what liberation it gives you, writing a story that is not necessarily factually yours and true.
Yes, well, one of the reasons Nora is female and not male, I mean, originally when I wrote The Midnight Library, started writing The Midnight Library, I was writing a male character, and I kept on changing the name, I kept on changing various aspects of him, and I just wasn't feeling it. And I think one of the reasons, weirdly, why I wasn't feeling it, that character, is because it was too like me, and I didn't want to write me again, and I wanted to make sure it clearly wasn't me. And one way I could write a novel about mental health and it not be me was just do a simple thing like change the gender, which is what I did, which is one of the reasons why Nora is Nora. And I just started to feel for her more, have more sympathy with her situation, because I had that distance, I think, from me, because I definitely was not writing myself. I think, you know, I see myself, even though a lot of people know me primarily for Reasons to Stay Alive, I see myself as a novelist because, you know, before Reasons to Stay Alive, I wrote 9 novels, if you factor in children's books as well. I feel safer within fiction. I don't just mean in the sense that I'm not directly writing about me and my family and my partner, although that stuff plays a part, but I just feel freer and able to explore things in a way I simply wouldn't be able to when I'm writing about nonfiction. I feel in a way, certainly in terms of my autobiographical story, I've said pretty much everything I need or require to say, you know, in terms of, well, Reasons to Stay Alive and Notes on a Nervous Planet. There will possibly be a third nonfiction book, but that's going to be very much less about me, more about various things that I've found comforting, various quotes and resources and stuff. But no, writing this about mental health, I felt in a way almost even truer than Reasons to Stay Alive. Even though Reasons to Stay Alive was factual, I feel like with fiction you can actually get to that deep level truth, and not just fiction. With me, I run out of reality quite quickly, so I like to sort of step into a multiverse or step into some fantastical concepts, because I kind of feel like if you're writing fiction, you might as well really write fiction and explore things through metaphor, through science fiction, through different things, and in that sort of roundabout way you actually can reach a bigger truth by telling a bigger lie, if that makes sense.
Nora gets to try lots of alternative lives, lots of those alternative forks taken, lots of roads less traveled. Some of them involve her being celebrated and highly accomplished and famous. Some of them involve her being scholarly. You are kind of lacerating about the effects and pressures and nightmares of fame, both in her existence as an Olympic champion and celebrity speaker, and in her role as a rock star. She has an extraordinarily brutal time.
Yes. Yes, I obviously haven't ever been a internationally renowned rock star on a world tour, and I've never been an Olympic swimmer. But just in my limited experiences of public life, you know, because like once I was booked by some celebrity speaker agency, and I put a few of those sort of feelings in there. But it's more, you know, it's more a comment on the values we have and the values we're increasingly encouraged to have. I mean, if you think about, for instance, reality TV, which precedes social media, if you think of reality TV starting at end of the 90s, start of the noughties, we've had that for like a generation now, those sort of values from reality TV. And I'm not dissing all of reality TV. I love a good reality TV show. But very often the thing I don't like about it is you have the central idea behind it is that fame is presented as a kind of salvation, and that normal life is something you need to be saved from. I love watching, you know, people sing songs and all of that. What I don't like is this idea that there's this magic golden ticket to a better universe, and that most of us, 99.9999% of us, will never know that better universe because Simon Cowell hasn't waved his magic wand at us. And I feel, I feel that's been exaggerated even further by social media, where we're constantly comparing ourselves. Well, not everyone, but a lot of people, especially young people, are constantly comparing themselves inevitably because of the mechanism of social media to other people, and not just other people we would have once been surrounded by in our village or town, but, you know, people from all over the world. The most popular people in the world, the most conventionally good-looking people in the world, the most talented people in the world, the richest people in the world, whatever it is. So it's almost like we're encouraged to feel like normality is some kind of failure, like having a normal, fulfilling human existence is some kind of failure because we're not billionaires, or we're not a Kardashian or whatever it is. And I'm not trying to be too satirical about it. I'm just trying to literally imagine if you were in those lives, what they would feel like. And that was how I'd imagine certainly a woman would feel in those sort of high-pressured situations where it becomes so much about what she's supposed to look like, or what other people's expectations are for her in those in those situations, in those worlds.
And the quiet, intimate, familial moments in each of these lives that she might have lived and can now theoretically opt into if she wishes, however famous or not she is, the private familial relationships are always really tested and often found to be quite disappointing. The romantic relationships are disappointing or unfulfilling, although the birth family connections are profound and ultimately the ones that really root her into her life.
Yeah, I mean, it's a book about siblings in some ways. It's almost like a love story between a brother and sister. That's definitely one of the main subplots I wanted to put into it. It's it's more about the fact that she feels that external pressure and pressure she's felt from other people directly onto her about what she is supposed to be. And that a lot of that has been, certainly at the start of the novel, absorbed into her and ingrained into her psyche. So in terms of relationships, she's feeling, as other people her age and friends are partnered off or becoming parents, and she's it's kind of a common situation for everyone in their 30s who is in that situation, and they feel expectations from other people and they're not quite sure of their own expectations for themselves. And so a lot of the book for Nora is untangling other people's expectations from her own expectations. But absolutely, it's a book, I think, about family. It's a book about how we feel we can disappoint our family in some ways, and how often that sense of guilt or shame or regret is unfounded, or at least it wouldn't have actually been much better doing it another way. And also, obviously, Nora's life turns out differently if Nora makes other decisions. But what I also wanted to explore is how other people's lives end up different if Nora made other decisions, and not always in the way that Nora or that particular person would have expected. If we make a different decision about something, then a different outcome occurs. But it's not necessarily, no one's Nostradamus, it's not necessarily the outcome we can predict.
There's an extraordinary chapter, well, there are many extraordinary chapters in the book, but there's one that I wanted to particularly ask you about, and I realize that we are teetering on the brink of what might look like a spoiler. But anyone who has already read this book will, I think, follow where I'm going with this. And anyone who hasn't yet read the book, please don't hang around. Just give yourself the treat of it. You can buy it from any good bookshop anywhere that you can find, and we can sell it to you online, and we'll send you a link for that. But the fascinating familial setup that I want to ask you about is the one in which she has a highly successful professional academic career, and she has a stable and affluent and relatively happy life with a daughter who is clearly an emotional tie and a root. And what's extraordinary about this for me reading it is I know that the Matt Haig who wrote Reasons to Stay Alive is rooted by Andrea and your family. You rhapsodize romantic and familial love. But here you give her the opportunity, quite unsentimentally, to walk away from that. And it just seems to me to be a beautifully surprising and really shocking in some way plot development.
Yeah, I thought it was important that would happen. But to be honest, when I was writing it, although it feels like the way it ends, and that's not the ending, what we were talking about there isn't the ending. The way it ends is kind of like the only way it can end, really, for me to say what I want to say with it. But to get to that ending, I genuinely didn't know what was going to happen in each life, and I didn't know, but it certainly wasn't a plan for all of the lives to be terrible or all of the lives to be great. It wasn't like, I wasn't doing, what's that film, Bedazzled, where it's how every life is terrible. I definitely wanted some of the lives to be terrible, but some of the lives are clearly a mixed bag, and some of the lives, like that one, are good. And so it's not a case that be careful what you wish for, because sometimes things that you wish for actually turn out pretty good. But my point, in that life was, I wanted this book. I wanted somehow Nora to find something internal, to find some kind of strength or courage or knowledge that wasn't provided by the external situation. She had to go through a lot of different external experiences to get there. But I kind of wanted, in a way, by the end of the book, for Nora to have had almost everything. So she's had the money, she's had the fame, she's had the success, she's had various partners, she's had a child in this case. And I kind of wanted her to have lived everything. Now, it was obviously very delicate. That section was definitely the hardest to write, how to get her to sort of walk away. And, I never know if I get the balance right. I want, people, this was unabashedly a book to try and make people feel good. But I also want it to be a book that feels true at times. And that was definitely a time where I felt a difficult decision had to be made. I felt like unless she made not all the decisions should be easy. For her to have, she had to show growth, especially towards the end of the book. So that was one of the reasons. And also it's about, how much she inhabits these other Noras versus how much she inhabits herself, and what she actually values really. And is it something that she makes for herself, or is it something that's kind of given to her by another version of herself? So all of those things were playing a part. But that, to me, more than the ending, that chapter or those chapters were the most emotional to write, because my biggest fear often is losing family, whether it's the family I live with, whether it's parents, whatever, losing people is just that big primal fear. So to write about it is how you kind of come to terms with it. And yeah, I suppose it's the part that links most to How to Stop Time as well, because that was very much about things we leave behind and loves we leave behind and family and partners we leave behind. So there's a sense of sort of grief and mourning that's familiar from that too.
Another connection to How to Stop Time and the Albatross Society is the not inevitable but wonderful connection to other fellow travelers. And there is a story in which she first encounters someone who is on the same path as her, who isn't in a library, has another frame of reference. So could you talk a little bit about that sense of how you define your own life's categorizings, and the way in which you very playfully and brilliantly introduced different ways in which people might have decided to shape their own experience?
Yes. Well, around the halfway mark in this novel, she meets another character called Hugo, a dashing Frenchman who she meets while in the Arctic Circle. And Hugo comes to play quite a significant part, I think, in Nora's development. But he's primarily interesting for me because he was another character like her. He was another character between lives and could transport himself to different lifetimes. So it's the life where she realizes she's not unique, but he doesn't have a midnight library. He doesn't have a library at all. He has a video store. So in his version of Limbo, he's between life and death. He's in a French video store from the 80s or early 80s, where which is uncle owned, and all the lives are blank video cassettes for him, because it was a significant location in his life when he was a child, was the video store, and it's where he hung out. So it's not, I wanted to be clear that the Midnight Library isn't everybody's version of Between Life and Death. It's very much Nora's version, and that other people would see different things and have different places to return to. But essentially the concept and the structure of it is the same. You know, he could take a video from a shelf, he could play the video, then he would be in the film of his life. He'd be in that version of a life rather than the book of his life. And yeah, so it's basically that. It's basically the mechanism is almost too complicated for Nora and Hugo or any person to actually see how it works. So the brain, between life and death, the brain translates the complexity of the multiverse through a familiar physical metaphor. So the Midnight Library is both real and not real. It's real in terms of offering these real life and real choices, but it's also their translation of reality, their simplification of reality. So there isn't necessarily really a video store or really a library. There is these other lives that they can get to via the library and via the video store, but it's the human brain simplifying it, like the human brains do all the time. Neuroscientists always talk about tests where we see reality in a more simple way than it actually is, you know, all kinds of tricks of the eye and different things. This is a simplified version of the quantum universe, which allows them to clearly be able to choose and shape whichever life they go into, if that makes sense.
This is a book that deals with despair and profound loneliness and reaches towards compassion and understanding and empathy above all. But I wanted to ask you, before we open this up to everybody who's joining us from all over the world, a question about tone. Because one of the wonders of this book is that it speaks directly to us and finds a way that is, whilst dealing with incredibly complicated concepts like anhedonia, it finds a way of being incredibly welcoming and easy. And I wonder about the process you have for clarity of communication, for simplicity. The language is incredibly complicated, but extraordinarily powerful, and it reaches a simplicity which feels like a form of grace at times. And I'm just intrigued as to whether that comes naturally or the way in which you work it.
Well, it's very kind of you to put it like that. Some reviewers have put it in less flattering terms occasionally with my previous books. But yeah, no, I don't know. I look back to the novels I wrote at the start of my career, which not many people read, to be honest. I wrote a book called The Possession of Mr. Cave, which was my third book, which now I find really kind of hard to look at. Well, A, because I wrote it, but also because it's so dark and bleak, but also it's very densely written. And my writing style has definitely changed and evolved over the years. It's quite interesting when you're a writer of various books over time. It's almost like looking at old photo albums and sort of cringing at old haircuts. Not that I have hair anymore, but it's kind of like that. It's kind of like looking back at selfies, but they're sort of mind selfies. And although you could quite like or be proud of a book you wrote 10 years ago, it's very rare that you would actually write that same book. Yeah, and in terms of accessibility, I deliberately and consciously try and write clearly. Whereas when I started out, I wasn't like I was trying to be obscure, but I almost felt that to be, you know, when I was insecure and trying to be a sort of intellectual writer, I almost felt like you had to be difficult. Whereas it's actually sometimes easier to be difficult. You have to work at being clear. And I'm not always clear when I speak, but when I write, I try and rework and rework and rework, and to not dumb anything down, but to actually take something complicated and make it into a story and make it into something that actually feels nice to read, and actually forget for a while that you're writing a book and imagining a big metaphorical campfire where everyone's sat round and maybe can contribute different bits. You know, I'm not even shy occasionally to test things out on social media, different ideas. Of the title, The Midnight Library, I didn't know whether it should have a "the" at the front of it or just be called Midnight Library, like Midnight Cowboy. I was in total two minds. I literally went on social media and asked people, and you know, it was overwhelmingly, it should have a "the" in front of it. And I've got no embarrassment about doing that, because I feel like, you know, the art of publication and the art of writing is to be read and to be public and to be out there. And, you know, I want people to read the stories and feel like they're for them. And, you know, it's not just about me indulging myself, but I actually want to tell a story, if that makes sense. So I ignore things like, you know, the genre terms of what literary is or what commercial is or what science fiction is, you know, what a love story is, and just try and take the best bits and the bits I like. And, you know, it's always about, you can never totally mind read another reader, but you can mind read yourself, and to just literally try and write the book at that point in time that you would yourself want to read. And if you don't want to read it yourself, why would anyone else want to read it? So that has to be the ultimate test.
Yeah, I love that. There's a whole thing about the pleasure of reading, which you give in just spades to all of us. Emma here online is asking very much about that issue around your relationship with the reader, which I think you've just addressed to a degree. But she says your work helps people. Do you think about the impact of your story on a reader, or do you just write for yourself? And I think in addition to that, I wonder if you now have a weight of kind of responsibility, because you know people read you in order to try and reclaim their lives and feel better. Is that a burden, or is it a great sense of joy for you?
Well, I suppose it could be a bit of both. I mean, I felt a great burden after Reasons to Stay Alive. Directly after Reasons to Stay Alive, I almost ran away from Reasons to Stay Alive, as far as I could run away from it, in the sense that, for instance, a couple of mental health charities wanted me to represent them and be a spokesperson. I totally ran away from that. In terms of the next book, when I was being slightly persuaded into writing another mental health book, I went away and wrote a children's book about Father Christmas, which was about as far away from writing about suicide or depression as I could think. And for a couple of years, I really struggled with it. One, because my mental health wasn't 100% better anyway. And so lots of people were saying, oh, you really helped me with, you know, Reasons to Stay Alive really helped me. And I can remember one winter, I think it must have been 2016 or 2015, I was in an anxiety patch and hardly able to leave the house. And people were saying, oh, your book saved my life and it helped me. And I was like, why can't my own advice help me? And I felt a bit of fraud after Reasons to Stay Alive. Not that I'd written anything that wasn't true. It was all absolutely true. But just the fact that it was helping people in a way that it wasn't necessarily helping me. And I found that very interesting. But I think what it was is basically people wanted to feel less alone. And the reason I wrote Reasons to Stay Alive is because 20 years ago, before social media, there were definitely books about depression, and very good books about depression and mental illness, but they're often very academic, very dense books, sometimes very depressing books about depression. And I definitely didn't want to write that. I wanted to write the book I needed when I was 24 on a literal and metaphorical cliff edge in Ibiza, and when I nearly took my life, and to see if there were any words that could hack into the brain. And, you know, I suppose that idea has spilled over beyond Reasons to Stay Alive, and it's kind of how I write now. I kind of write as a challenge to see if there are sort of words that could reach people who might be hard to reach at that point, to find hope in dark situations. But I don't do it because that's my thing now. In fact, as a writer, I always resist having a thing as much as possible. And I've been very lucky with my publishers, Canongate, who, as you know, Peter, they're an independent publisher, and they're based in Scotland, and they do things a little bit differently. And, you know, I've got a career which spans non-fiction, fiction, and children's books. And I feel very lucky and in a very unique situation that I've got a publisher who supports me equally in all those different things. But that said, yes, thematically, I definitely feel I've got a kind of groove that I write about. But I will definitely probably not write like that forever, because I don't think I'll be the same person forever. But at the moment, I feel like there's more to be mined, and I actually like trying to, you know, taking a dark situation and trying to find some positivity, some authentic sentimentality, that whole Frank Capra thing, you know, unabashedly accessible and stuff. And I really enjoy that style of writing. And it wasn't Reasons to Stay Alive, in fact. It was the book before Reasons to Stay Alive where I really found that. It was The Humans, or at least part of The Humans, which was the first book I wrote. It's a novel about an alien who comes to Earth. And that was the first book I wrote which had a properly happy ending, or at least an optimistic ending, an open ending. And up until that point, I've been very sniffy or snobby about anything resembling a vaguely happy ending. And I thought, to be a serious writer, you couldn't be optimistic. But in terms of my own life, I think that optimism comes from recovering to a great deal from depression, because depression just gives you pessimism. And actually, optimism was a more authentic and more useful and more practical thing for me to have. And actually, you know, people talk about false optimism and false hope, but I lived with false pessimism for years, and that false pessimism nearly killed me. So I would take hope any day of the week. You know, the pessimism in my head once told me I'd be dead at the age of 25, but everyone in my life would leave me to it, and all of this, and nothing good in my life would ever come to be. And I fortunately held on long enough to realize that wasn't the case, but it was definitely touch and go for a little while, and it was certainly hell for a good deal of time. And, you know, one of the reasons I write so affectionately about Andrea in Reasons to Stay Alive is because she, you know, I wasn't easy to live with in my 20s. I was, you know, I wasn't abusive, but just the state of my illness made me a difficult person to live with. You know, I couldn't leave the house on my own. You know, I said some pretty morbid, horrendous things, and she was there, and she stood through me through all that. So I suppose what I'm doing with my books is trying to pay something back and put it back into the universe, and actually make people feel a bit less lonely, or to try and be there for them. And then what happens is, you know, from my selfish perspective, then people come back to me and say, oh, that experience you did was very similar to mine, or Nora's experience in the Midnight Library is what I went through, and this, that, and the other. And so that sense of loneliness that I had throughout my 20s, in the sense that I didn't know of anyone else who had felt like that, suddenly it becomes a community. And it's very nice to hear those things and those echoes that come back. So publishing a book is like shouting into a cave, and then you get a response, and you get that comfort of finding your people, and finding people who've been through similar stuff and want to hear the same kind of things.
Can I ask you two questions that are really specifically about the novel? First is from Yannicka, who says, Nora is 35. What made you decide the main character should be that age not someone in their 60s or even 80s with regrets about past decisions?
Yeah, well, I think it's partly because of the book I'd written before, the novel I'd written before, How to Stop Time, was literally about the oldest character I could think of, talking about an 800 and something year old man who's looking back on a lot of history. So I'd done that book about time passing and age, and I wanted to do something a little bit different here, and a little bit like, the sort of person that I was when I had a breakdown, even though I was younger than Nora when I had a breakdown. And 35 feels like the first of those. It's not quite middle age, but it's the first of those sort of turning point ages. And certainly in terms of career and relationships and family life and stuff, it feels like the first time you have those questions. So I wanted it to be an age where you had something behind you, but you also had a lot of life in front of you. You had more life in front of you, more hope, and to also almost point out that, what depression can feel like. Like, you can actually feel like you've got nothing in front of you at whatever age. I felt that at 24. So it wasn't too much of a stretch for me to give Nora that kind of perspective at 35, basically. But yeah, I definitely want to write a novel from an older character, and that probably will be my next book. It will be a realistic age as well. It won't be like 800 or an immortal vampire or something. It will be, someone in their 70s or 80s or something. That would be good.
Gwen asks, I love this question, do you imagine Nora and Hugo, the French fellow slider that you mentioned earlier, ever meeting as their root selves? And I guess we ought to explain that the root life is the life that we're first introduced to.
Yes, the root life is your life before you enter the library of a video store or whatever it is. That's the life we're living right now. And yes, so in Nora's root life, she's living in England, in Bedford, and Hugo's living in France, and it is definitely perfectly possible, especially as things progress, that within Nora's root life, she could happen upon Hugo. And even in this novel, she meets Hugo more than once in more than one life. So, I suppose if there's any point of this book at all, it's that we enter a different universe within the same universe all the time. We every decision we make is a new universe, is a new possibility. So there is absolutely every possibility, if not probability, that Nora would meet Hugo in this life. Or, and there's another man called Ash in it, and there's possibilities with him as well, and different things. But I didn't want Nora's fate to be defined or tied to one particular person, particularly not a male person. So yeah, there's a lot of openness and possibility.
You've mentioned a couple of times cinematic references, and man, this is a very long way away from Midnight Cowboy. But there are there are joyful resonances with It's a Wonderful Life, with Sliding Doors.
Yeah.
Are there literary references as well that you were consciously playing with here?
I suppose the most obvious one is Borges, his short stories, Jorge Luis Borges, whose name I've been working on getting right. If you're Spanish, I'm still probably getting it wrong. But he for those that don't know, Borges was very famous at and brilliant at quite surreal and metaphorical stories. He wrote about a magical library called the Library of Babel. It wasn't a library full of parallel lives, but it was a library full of every potential book in existence. So, anything with magical libraries, and that one in particular was an inspiration. And Borges is also the reason why the band that Nora's in is called The Labyrinth, because that was the title of his Labyrinth was the title of his famous short story collection, and that would be the main one. I mean, you know, it is always, I find it very, I mean, there's obvious nods to the films you mentioned, but I find it harder with literary influences to sort of, they're so deeply absorbed. Like, you know, I would see influences in it that would be hard to explain, like Graham Greene. I like Graham Greene because he wrote a lot about regret, and I'm obsessed with Graham Greene. And I was the only person doing the MA course at Leeds University in 1999 who took the module on Graham Greene out of that English literature course. I was literally the only person in the seminars week by week, and the tutor, who always was very smartly dressed in a shirt and tie, he really did not like me very much. He was a very strict Catholic tutor, and he deliberately, and I've still got an issue with this, he deliberately gave me 69% in my dissertation, which was one off getting a first, which stopped me getting a first, and I've still got issues with that because I think it was quite a good dissertation on Graham Greene. But yes, I'm getting over it now. But yes, Graham Greene, I think in this one particularly is there, because Graham Greene, you know, you can pick up any Graham Greene, you know, The Power and Glory, Man in Havana, or whatever it is, and there's a sense, it's almost a feeling. I like writers who just have a feeling, and you know, Graham Greene, although he would have ended this in a very different way to me, but he very much was, you know, regret and guilt and shame and all those things just oozed off the page. Emily Dickinson is someone who changed my life, and I read a lot of Emily Dickinson at the time I wrote The Humans, and I think since then, you know, talking about clarity and simple writing, you know, Emily Dickinson poems you can read in about 2 minutes, and yet they can actually stay with you and mean different things forever. And I'm not saying I get anywhere near that, but that idea of compressing power in a very sort of short and clear space is something I aim for sometimes with, you know, which Emily Dickinson was the master at. So often, you know, poets can be as influential as novelists and films and stuff like
that. There's a question from Granor here, which is fundamental, I think. She says, you've tackled time travel more directly in your previous book, How to Stop Time. Here is the same, but for different versions of the same person. It's a different dimension of time.
Yeah.
Is time a particular fascination for you? And if so, why?
I don't know. I think I don't know how time can't be fascinating. Time is kind of like, everything is about time. If we're having a bad time in life, often it's because of time. It's either because of regret or fear. And regret and fear are the two things that kind of dominate our negative thoughts, I think. Regret is obviously about the past. Fear is generally about the future. And I feel that I'm obsessed with time because I kind of want to escape it. I want to properly, you know, I'm suspicious of terms like mindfulness and stuff, but to properly be mindful, to properly live like we imagine a lot of animals live, literally in the present, free from those sort of regrets, free from those fears from the future. Because of course there is no future and there is no past. There's only ever a present. There's only, you know, going back to Emily Dickinson, forever is composed of nows, and we're always just in a now. And whatever future we fear, it's never quite the future we arrive at. And yet we spend so much of our life imagining or fearing or catastrophizing or hoping about the future. And it's never the future we arrive at, because we never arrive at the future for a start. We're always in the present, and it's never entirely predictable, which is definitely one of the themes in the Midnight Library. And yeah, and the past too, you know, that regret, the mourning, with sort of shame or guilt, or, you know, it's fundamentally not useful. It's not you know, we have it, but it's not useful. Yes, we can learn from mistakes. Yes, if we touch a hot stove, we stop touching the hot stove. But to live our presence swamped by things we've done in the past, that's when depression starts to kick in. So I've spent this year reading a lot of Buddhism. Actually, I'm not becoming a Buddhist. I'm very much agnostic / atheist, but I read a book called When Things Fall Apart by Pema Chodron, who's American Tibetan Buddhist, and she's very good on time, very good on uncertainty and embracing uncertainty, because we see it, especially in the West, uncertainty about time and the future as something to fear. But uncertainty, when you think about it, is also the root of hope. The fact that we never know something ahead of us in time is where hope springs from, you know. So we need uncertainty to have possibility, to be able to enter new universes, and to have that old-fashioned thing called hope.
Matt, before we end, and I want to ask you if you'd be very kind and read a very short chapter just to give people a flavor of the language and the way you tell this story. There's a question that takes us back, I think, to where we began, about being in lockdown and the strangeness of these times. And Antonia asks, how has your understanding of the book changed from the time you wrote it until now?
That's a really, really good question. And I think it's so true that every writer, like, by the time, because of the nature of the book world, I'm lucky that my publishers fight quite fast. But so much time seems to have passed, especially this year in 2020, since I finished writing The Midnight Library. I essentially finished it at Christmas. I edited it a bit in January, February, March, but essentially it was done at Christmas. And so it's kind of strange when it comes to be published, because it's suddenly not yours anymore. And it's almost like a book someone else wrote. And it's you kind of having to remember what you wrote, and then suddenly people are reading it, and it becomes something slightly different with every single reader out there. And I think the thing I would say about this book now is I actually, sincerely, I do genuinely feel, you know, there's definitely bits that I've read and I'd probably rewrite in a different way already, but I feel actually happier with this book than any of my other books, and less likely to sort of meddle with it than any of my other books. And that may change in the future, but I feel like this book and a novel I wrote called The Humans were ones that I wrote at just the right time for the subject matter. And it, you know, there's no such thing as being perfectly happy with anything you've written, but I feel like I got everything I wanted to get into it. You know, in some ways it's not the most unpredictable story in the world. In some ways, you know, there's certain themes that have been explored elsewhere, but for what I was trying to do and how I was trying to comfort myself at that point in time, I did it exactly how I wanted to the best of my ability. And it's rare, I think, at this point to still have that feeling. Like, often, even with Reasons to Stay Alive, I was having kind of questions and doubts about it. No doubt there will be things I feel differently about now, but yeah, I think I understand more that it's a book about regrets and how I came to terms with regrets. And that was kind of what I was writing it to do. And I'm glad that other people are getting that from it. But that was a very good question. If not a very good answer, that was great.
I started it at 12 and finished it at about 4:30 with a feeling of sort of euphoric kind of joy, actually. And I heartily recommend it to everyone. Go out, go to your local library if you can, go to your local bookshop, buy it, share it, give it to everyone you love and care about. We've got 50 signed copies on sale through the festival website, and Poppy, my brilliant colleague who's been hosting this gig on the chat line, will link you up to that if you'd like to do it. Thank you all for being here. I'd like to end with Matt giving this reading. It's a very short piece, but I think it's a treasure, and it also sets up the library and introduces you to the place.
Yes, I will. And before that, I just want to thank the Haig Festival, who are brilliant, and they've done immensely this year with all the turmoil. You know, the Haig Festival is May, so they had a logistical nightmare, and Peter and the team have been amazing this year. And I'm honoured that they're hosting me, and this was lovely. And the last time me and Peter spoke to each other was at a festival on stage in Italy. So I hope to be face-to-face with you lot and with Peter at some time in the future. But anyway, I thought I would be very obvious and read a chapter which is literally called The Midnight Library. And this is not at the start of the book, this is page 29, but it's one of the first, it's the sort of the first entry to The Midnight Library for Nora. As she spoke, Mrs. Elm's eyes came alive. Mrs. Elm is the librarian. Twinkling like puddles in moonlight. Between life and death, there is a library, she said. And within that library, the shelves go on forever. Every book provides a chance to try another life you could have lived, to see how things would be different if you had made other choices. Would you have done anything different if you had the chance to undo your regrets? So I am dead, Nora asked. Mrs. Elm shook her head. No. Listen carefully. Between life and death. She gestured vaguely along the aisle towards the distance. Death is outside. Well, I should go there because I want to die. Nora began walking. But Mrs. Elm shook her head. That isn't how death works. Why not? You don't go to death. Death comes to you. Even death was something Nora couldn't do properly, it seemed. It was a familiar feeling, this feeling of being incomplete in just about every sense. An unfinished jigsaw of a human, incomplete living and incomplete dying, which is bleak, but it gets a bit more happy.
Matt, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
Thank you, everyone.
Wonderful.